Okay, everyone, good evening. I'm Brian Edwards, Dean of the School of Liberal Arts, and we are thrilled to welcome you to our Election 2020 event, originally scheduled as a pre-election conversation to give deep context on what we were calling then an historic election. Because of the arrival of Hurricane Zeta in our midst and wiped out the power of almost everyone who you see in front of you right now, and also everyone who might be watching or listening. We rescheduled the event until after the election, not knowing then what would happen. Of course, we all had a bunch of guesses. And so we are actually kind of pleased that we have the opportunity to come together with you today to do a couple of things, try to give some context to what did happen, and to explain what is happening, and to take a little bit of a look forward at what might happen in the future after these historic elections. We'll be focusing primarily on the presidential elections, but actually, as you'll see, we really want to talk a lot about other congressional elections and also Louisiana politics, because there were some really important initiatives on the ballot in a number of places. A couple of things I want to say before I introduce our fabulous panel. As you note, the title bringing that his Tulane experts bring context to an historic election. The word context and the word expert are really important at this moment. I think one of the things that we all have watched, those of us who've watched the election very carefully, have seen that there's really such a flurry of information out there. In fact, one of the things that really marks this campaign and this campaign season, if not the last 4 years or 5 years of presidential and congressional campaigns, is the ways in which we get information, the flurry of information, and in fact, even the question about what's true and what's a fact and what expertise really means. This panel is a nonpartisan panel. People may have their own opinions, and that's of course really important, but to bring expertise and to bring deep context from a variety of angles and directions and positions and disciplines is very much a part of the design of this panel. So we have two historians, a political scientist, a legal expert here on our panel. I will be asking questions of the panel, and of course we'll be having student questions throughout the evening. You are invited during the conversation to put a question in the Q&A. We'll all be kind of looking at them, monitoring them, and I will move back and forth when I see them. We also have a couple of students that we've invited to join us and ask formal questions, and we'll bring those on a little bit later. But before we go any further, I want to introduce our wonderful panel. First, I will introduce things alphabetically. Is Karissa Haugeberg, who is an associate professor of history in the School of Liberal Arts here at Tulane, of course, and a fellow in the medical ethics program. Her book, her 2017 book, Women Against Abortion Inside the Largest Moral Reform Movement of the 20th Century, examines women's work within the anti-abortion movement. And she's charted the rise of the crisis pregnancy centers, the evolution of violent and nonviolent protest strategies, and the realignment of abortion politics in the GOP and the Democratic Party. She's also served as an expert witness in 2 federal cases concerning abortion regulations after Roe v. Wade. And we'll be very excited to talk to her about politics, health politics, gender and politics, and a whole variety of questions. We also have Jana Lipman, also from the history department, the associate professor of history in US history. She's the author of In Camps, Vietnamese Refugees, Asylum Seekers, and Repatriates from 2020. And before that, a book on Guantanamo, A Working Class History Between Empire and Revolution from 2009. She teaches courses in US foreign relations, US immigration history, US labor history, and public history. She's also the Honors Professor of the Year in 2019. She's a beloved professor here and a recipient of the April Brayfield Award for Teaching in 2015. So we'll be asking Professor Lipman questions, especially about immigration policy, foreign relations, and other aspects to give some historical context. Scott Nolan, professor of practice in political science, specializes in American politics. By the way, Scott, you were recommended by both the College Democrats and the College Republicans to be invited to our panel. So a bipartisan recommendation for Professor Nolan. His teaching focuses on the courts and the law, the role of sexuality and gender identity in politics, and research methodologies. And he's informed by more than 15 years of full-time work in law firms in New Orleans and Boston. And his own research focuses on the experiences of LGBTQ people in American courts, and is a faculty advisor for Phi Alpha Delta, the pre-law fraternity, and a first-year faculty fellow. And finally, Robert Wesley, who's the LOCHEF Professor of Legal Ethics and Professional Responsibility in the Tulane School of Law. We're very happy to have you here this evening. Professor Wesley's research and teaching interests are in the fields of critical race theory, constitutional law, philosophy of law, law and literature, and the legal profession. He is the author of Restitution Claims for Wrongful Enslavement and the Doctrine of the Master's Good Faith, and from 2016, as well as First-Time Encounters, Passing, Revisited, and Demystification as a Critical Practice in the Law Journal of Law and Social Policy. He's right now working on a book on reparations for historical injustice, obviously a topic that's been very much discussed even in the campaigns. And he will present and discuss his work in a workshop, Critical Race Theory for the New Millennium at the CAS, and will be giving a lecture in Munich called Can There Be Racial Reconciliation Without Reparations? Thank you for letting me take the time for this to introduce this panel. And I think you can see that we have quite a range of directions on which we want to broach this topic. Let me start by saying that one of the things that's been very interesting in the time between when this panel was originally going to be held and tonight, of course, is the way it's all unfolding. And one of the things that I've been really interested in following the last many presidential elections is the ways in which changes in media and communication has really changed the way candidates campaign, the way we follow those campaigns, and the way we talk about them. And the fact that we're doing this on Zoom to an audience, virtual audiences, obviously reflects the conditions of the COVID pandemic, which themselves had a major impact on the campaign itself, but also the ways in which in 2016, President Trump, or then candidate Trump, really orchestrated then not completely new, but different kinds of media technologies, social media, particularly Twitter, and something in my own writing on Trump, reality television as a logic played out very much in 2016. And it's remarkable in 2020 to watch the last several weeks, I'm not talking about months, but several weeks or days play out within, let's call the logics of reality television, everything from the moment. And in fact, Mark Burnett, his former producer on Celebrity Apprentice, commented that when President Trump arrived back at the White House in that off the helicopter and stood on the at the White House looking down on the crowd and took off his mask, it was Mark Burnett who said that it reminded him of the end of a season 1 of a reality show, right? And now as we watch in the aftermath of the election and the counting and the drama of this, today, a lot of people's eyes are following kind of two sorts of dramas unfolding, and one, of course, is the final counts and so on, and President-elect Biden and Vice President-elect Harris's speeches, and the other is the sort of drama unfolding on the other side about whether Republican senators will acknowledge the election results that were called the thing. So just to think about the way that media, from a critical standpoint, kind of frames the way we understand this election itself is something that is very different, of course, in previous elections, and something that I think we might want to reflect on. But let me turn to my first question. I'll turn to Scott Nolan, and talking about the ways in which polling themselves and statistics and the way we read polls have become a part of the way many people follow campaigns. And political prognosticators like Nate Silver's 538 predicted a clear win for Joe Biden. However, on election night, and indeed all last week, many people were stunned by how well President Trump did with voters. Did this surprise you, or should we actually have expected a close election?
Well, hi, everybody. Thanks so much, Brian, for hosting this event. And thank you all for joining us tonight. It's been just a crazy year, crazy semester, crazy 7 to 10 days in this country, right? And so as I'm kind of processing the last week, I've got some kind of statistics that I'm keeping in mind and also kind of some big picture points. And so as we sit here right now, as of about tonight, we're looking at Biden winning the popular vote by about 76 million votes to about 71 million votes to Trump. And so that's 52% for Biden and 48% to Trump. It looks like Biden won more than 50% of the votes cast. That's slightly different than 2016, where Clinton won 48% of the votes cast, Trump won 46% of the votes cast, and the rest went to third and other parties. The third thing is, it seems like when all this is said and done, what the electoral college map is going to look like is that Biden will have flipped long red Arizona, long red Georgia, and also gaining back usually blue Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. I don't believe that Trump flipped any states from blue to red from 2016 to 2020. And so what I think we're going to end up with is an electoral vote about 306 to 232. And polling is imperfect. Polling can be off. Nate Silver, Real Clear Politics, even CNN and the New York Times had Biden leading in the popular vote around the country, approximately 7, 8 to 9 points, depending on the poll, depending on what kind of questions were asked, where and when. And so what it looks like is at the end of the day, we've got a spread between the two candidates of about 4.2 to 4.5%. And so not dead on the polls, but at least they predicted the eventual winner. When I think about the big picture, pulling back from those specifics, I'm thinking about whether or not this is truly surprising now that I'm a week into it. And Trump's performance last week really doesn't surprise me. If I treat Trump just as another conservative Republican, research tells us that voters are drawn to parties and candidates based on economic policy, social issues, and then personality. And what I mean by personality is this person presidential? Are they right-minded? Are they ethical? Are they good? Are they ready, serious, steady? And it doesn't surprise me that there are 71 million people who vote for Trump. It doesn't surprise me that there's 21 million voters who are economically and socially conservative in this country. But I am surprised that there's 71 million voters who would vote for someone who acts like Donald Trump does sometimes. And I thought personality was going to doom him, but apparently not. And it was closer on election night than it is now, obviously. And for a while, there was a very close election before I went to bed on election night. I definitely thought it was going to be much closer than it ended up being. I think Biden clearly won, but his prize is a country that is profoundly angry and depressed, literally sick and tired. I think if a country can get PTSD, we've got it. One thing I've wrestled with since 2016, especially 2020, is the extent to which people, whether it be in my own life, whether it be family or friends or professional colleagues, might be willing to support a candidate who I think social scientists would agree, certainly people in the press would say, has at least authoritarian impulses from time to time, who leads with what social scientists would call at times a patriarchal sexism, perhaps racism, an endless supply of cruelty going back and forth, at times evidence of corruption, clearly buttressed with things like lies and gaslighting from time to time. And I think a thread throughout is also science denialism. And so I was surprised on election night that people would prefer this, but I'm also aware that this country has a lot of conservative Republicans in it. And a lot of people are voting for policy and not for personality. They don't vote for candidates, they vote for who they want to control the institutions of government. And so either conservatives and Republicans look past his personality because they wanted economic and social policy to go their way, which I suppose is understandable, or conservatives and Republicans like what they see in Trump in terms of his personality. And that is a little bit troubling to me. I think it's quite sobering. I think the party is going to have to reinvent itself if it wants to do well in the Electoral College going forward.
All right, let's before we jump too far forward, let me turn to Professor Wesley, Robert, and ask you a little bit about what stands between those election results or election counting and the kind of declaration of a winner, let's say. And we're going to go to your legal expertise here. I know there's a lot of lawsuits that have been filed. It's hard to, they're probably being filed as we speak right now. So I don't expect anyone's kept up on all of them so far at all, and even more than have been reported. But just generally speaking, will President Trump be successful in forcing a crisis over the election outcome, or what do you see as the way this is turning in terms of the courts?
Thank you so much for that question. And I also would like to say how pleased I am to be able to participate in this discussion. Um, I think that if President Trump is successful in forcing a crisis, it won't be as a result of one of these election-related lawsuits. None of them have any merits, with the possible exception of one, the one that was filed in Pennsylvania. And even if that decision went his way, it wouldn't deliver him enough votes to change the outcome. So I think, on top of the fact that it seems to me that the Supreme Court would not be willing to hand down a decision that would essentially change nothing. So I really don't think that it's going to be a result of any of the lawsuits that have been filed. I do worry that that in the interregnum between now and Inauguration Day, that Trump has a lot of cards to play that can force a crisis for this country. I think we may have seen even today the beginnings of a crisis, to the extent that we now seem to have from Pfizer what appears to be an effective vaccine. In order for that vaccine to actually begin to get to the American people, however, it's going to require that that the Trump administration cooperate with the incoming Biden administration, and he's not cooperating. I was also quite disturbed to hear that the Secretary of Defense was fired today by tweet, and replaced by someone who was not senior and does not have the adequate experience to hold that position. And it seems that it might be a prelude to some kind of international adventure that President Trump might be contemplating before the end of his term. So I really think that the election results are fairly secure. And even though a number of elected Republicans have failed to congratulate the president-elect on his victory, we have George Bush himself coming out and congratulating the president-elect on his victory. I mean, the George Bush of Florida 2000 fame. So I really think that there's going to be a lot of tantrums, but we have a new president now, and that administration will take office in January, in my view.
So just to follow up on that, you know, we've heard, as of today, only 4 Republican U.S. senators have kind of acknowledged Trump's victory. Biden's victory in the election. But the others, you're hearing, even in Susan Collins of Maine's kind of comments, you're hearing this sort of let the legal process play itself out. When you hear that, do you feel that is, and what do you hear in that? There are different messages that are being communicated. One is potentially, okay, you need to kind of have a sort of bring in those who voted for President Trump to feel that there's some, that they've exhausted all legal remedies. And another is sort of the creation of a greater crisis. How do you hear that when you hear those kind of mixed messages coming from the senators?
Well, I think all of the Republican elected officials have not really been candidates for profiles in courage. They are clearly afraid of this man because he has shown his capacity to be vindictive. What he holds over them at this point, I'm not really clear about. So it's not really transparent why they would hesitate. And I think that what's most strange to me is, given the unsettled state of the election in Georgia over the Senate candidates that could still flip the Senate to Democratic control, why they would allow or would not discourage Trump from continuing his obstruction and then focusing their efforts on getting those Republican candidates in, or at least one of them, so that they don't lose control of the Senate. It's not logical to me, but it's consistent with the behavior that we've seen throughout the entire Trump administration.
So I'm going to turn on that note to Karissa Haugeberg. One of the things that's come up is this extreme, and these first couple of questions, as you've seen, is a very polarized nature of American politics. And, there's been obviously a lot of hand-wringing about how fractured our polity is over the last several years. Speaking, as a historian in this context, how do you understand the polarized nature of American politics at this moment?
Well, thank you so much for having me here, and it's so much fun to be with this panel, and historians are always delighted to be invited to things like this. We often lament that historians aren't at the table often enough, so thank you for inviting us.
And look, you have 50% of the tables, it turns out.
Yeah, exactly. A few things come to mind, and indeed, abortion politics are more divisive now than arguably they've ever been. But I actually don't fear divisiveness. And my concern actually is the fear that Americans are feeling over divisiveness. One thing that I've been tracking is the Pew Research Center polls Americans every now and then about their willingness to speak to other people about politics. And during the Trump administration, the number of especially progressive Democrats who feel comfortable talking about politics has declined significantly. And to me, that's very worrisome. This is reminiscent to me of the McCarthy period, that people are worried that there are ramifications for arguing, for debate. And I also worry that a type of nostalgia is setting in, a nostalgia for an era when people got along, when Republicans and Democrats would, grab their golf clubs and go to and go play 9 holes. And to me, what comes to mind are the 1950s and 1960s. And if you go back and look at the composition of the US Senate at that time, there were no African Americans. There were African Americans in the US Senate during Reconstruction in the 1870s. There wasn't another one elected until 1967. When you look at women, the only women who served in the Senate were those whose husbands had died. There wasn't a woman elected in her own right until 1978. It was a woman from Kansas, Nancy Kassebaum. And so I worry when I hear people talk about nostalgia in this era when they all got along, that it wasn't people like me, that it's when women came onto the scene, when people of color came onto the scene, things got divisive and things got uncomfortable. So it's an unwelcome message. But when it comes to abortion, we've certainly seen the way in which that's become such a single issue motive for people. And what's really fascinating in this most recent election is that very conservative Catholics voted for Donald Trump because he promised to be the candidate of life, foregoing an actual Catholic candidate who spent last Sunday morning in church while the president was golfing. So it's, I share Professor Wesley's kind of sense of mystification, that it isn't logical to support life through fetal development, but then really be ambivalent about some of the policies that don't support life. And in the state of Louisiana, this has special significance just because we have one of the highest maternal mortality rates in the nation.
It's interesting on that point that some reporting over the weekend that was looking over the numbers of based on religion found that no longer, as the argument went, are Democrats or Republicans even bothering to try to run for against the kind of religion. Like people of religious faith were all voting the same way in 2020 as they did in 2016. People who don't indicate religious faith the same way in 2020 or 2016. That there was no movement there in terms of voting by party. And as you know, there are folks who are actually working in the evangelical community to try to kind of shake from within to try to shake up the kind of assumptions there. I mean, one is Billy Graham's. There was reporting on NPR this morning. Someone, forgetting a woman who's either his daughter or his niece, who's kind of trying to appeal to evangelicals because they're afraid of people leaving faith itself. So there's such a kind of ossification there, or kind of polarization, and yet there's some people trying to bridge that divide. Do you see that happening, in anti-abortion and abortion politics?
Let me make sure that I understand your question correctly.
Yeah.
Is your question that is there a movement within religious organizations to kind of realign themselves? So, for example, we've come to recognize, evangelical. So, yes and no. So, one of the issues with the Catholic Church has definitely moved much farther to the right, and a lot of people have also, we've seen a decline in the number of people who are members of mainline denominational churches. So the power of, for example, the Methodist Church or the Lutheran Church to really drive this train is really, really small. The only really religious constituency that's growing with any strength are those non-denominational evangelical churches. They're much harder to track, as my colleague in political science could tell you, but tend to be much more right-wing. Now, certainly there is a movement within evangelical communities to, especially the issue of immigration has galvanized a lot of them. So the policy of separating families really caused a lot of evangelical Christians to look again and have a more capacious view of their understanding of the relationship between religion and politics.
So let's move talking about immigration here. I'm going to ask Jana Lipman to join the conversation here. In 2016, President Trump campaigned against immigration, proposed building the wall, and against admitting refugees into the United States through the Muslim ban. Those were signature issues for him. What role do you think immigration policy or refugee admission kind of policy played in earlier elections, and how important was that in 2020? We heard so much about it in 2016, and much less about it, or it was framed in a slightly different way in 2020. How do you see that kind of shift happening?
Yeah, no, thank you so much. And thanks again for having the panel. And we look forward to more questions. I guess I would have a few different comments. One is that I would say that, and this, and to me, is a somewhat discouraging, but we have this sort of mythology in the United States of sort of the nation of immigrants and sort of this inclusive vision. But in fact, for much of US history, there's been hostility towards immigration. So while President Trump really was able to galvanize on a particularly anti-immigrant platform, this actually is not necessarily new in US history. It might have been new in the 21st century, but not if we have a longer view. And so I think it's really important for people who are listening and for students to know just about, in some ways, the violence of the 19th century, particularly the campaigns against Chinese migrants in the 19th century. And if we think about the first immigration laws historically have been restrictionists. So if we look at the 1875 Page Act, if we look at the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act, or the 1924 National Immigration Act. And so I think it's really important that we recognize there's a very long history of anti-immigration that was very popular. And again, recognizing again, the franchise is limited to white men, but within that constituency, there was nothing more popular than anti-Chinese politics in the 19th century, right? So it's really important to recognize that that is a larger framework. And in some ways, the sort of nostalgia for Ellis Island and the sort of sense of European immigrants really only becomes manifested in the 1950s and 60s with second generation European immigrants. So that's sort of that's my historian's take, sort of the longer view.
Right.
But I do think that there's a way that Trump was able to mobilize an anti-immigrant politics in 2016 that was really effective for him politically and really was a signature issue. And I think that it's true that is not what he ran on in 2020. And this is not the historian talking. I think he just couldn't. I think COVID was overwhelming. I think that there's a way in which he didn't change. His policies did not change. His platform did not change. But the concerns of people, you know, what they were thinking, what they were doing shifted dramatically because all of our lives had to change so much because of COVID. The one other thing I just want to add in terms of immigration policy, there's a, you know, President Trump was able to do a lot in terms of his executive orders, whether it was the restrictions to Muslim majority countries or sort of variety. He's trying to restrict even legal immigrants or sort of categories of legal immigration. And what students should also know is that is not, again, unusual. Immigration is generally held within the executive. And so people should recognize the executive often has a lot of latitude over immigration. So for example, President Obama used executive orders for the DACA recipients. I think with President-elect Biden, one would imagine he would also use the executive authority a great deal for immigration. I think it's very unlikely, in some ways, going back to what Scott was saying about the sort of gridlock. I don't know if gridlock is the right word, but I find it unlikely to see an immigration law coming out of Congress. I think it's going to still be mostly in the executive branch.
I'm going to jump over to one of the questions that we received from our audience that kind of builds on your point, Jana. But also let me invite our audience to write questions in the Q&A. You can type them directly, and we'll get to them. This is a question that moves away from the presidential election and further down in the sort of down ballot elections in Texas and California, and pointing out that Biden had a collapse of support in the Rio Grande Valley. So he's saying the question is, what do we make of the apparent down ballot Democratic failures there in these places? And this person says they're hesitant to make too many conclusions, but how can we explain apparent Democratic weakness among Hispanic voters? I saw just facial responses. Jana, Professor Lipman, you can take that one up first.
I want to take that one. Thank
Yeah.
you. Yeah, no, that question's for me. Thank you so much. And thanks for the question. I guess I have a couple of thoughts on this question. So first is the student could read my colleague Jerry Cadava's work. He's a professor at Northwestern. Brian might know him from the history department. He's just written a new book about conservatives, Mexican-American conservatives, which I would recommend to you. But I would also say that it is a mistake, I think, at least on my read of the election results, to see the Hispanic vote going disproportionately for President Trump. I think that the student or the questioner is correct. It may seem surprising, particularly Cuban Americans in Miami, as well as Mexican Americans along the border. I think that there are debates about questions of campaign outreach, about the ways in which political ideologies might be resonating with Mexican American communities along the border, as well as in Miami. But I want to add that there was huge support for President-elect Biden in places like Nevada and Arizona. And that is not, again, just because of like a knee-jerk, because people are Mexican American, but it's because of very heavy organizing that has been going on now for decades in Arizona and in Nevada, where I think it actually has not been as deep along the border, although there is a lot of organizing in Miami. And in particular, union organizing, Unite Here, which is the workers union for the casinos and the hotels in Las Vegas, which is very heavily invested in Latinx voters and their membership, as well as in Arizona. And particularly if you think about someplace like Phoenix and Sheriff Arpaio, we go to, the question of the fact that President Trump even pardoned Sheriff Arpaio, who has some of the harshest immigration policies, most punitive in the country, that they organized to, elect someone else to office, right? And so there's a way in which there's long-term organizing. And I guess I would say that there's two answers, I guess. One is to not think of all Latino voters as the same. That
Right.
might seem simple, but that's the first answer. The Latino vote doesn't exist. It is different based on nationality, generation, and class, and arguably race. So there's huge divisions within the quote unquote Latino voters. But that secondly, that in places that really focused on workers of color, large numbers came out for President-elect Biden, even though that you are also correct that you have sizable numbers, coming out of Miami and along the border. So that's just in
great.
context.
That's wonderful. And I think that underlining that point that, and as really this election shows that the Latino vote is not, one homogenous, and there's a lot of differentiating. It's a very basic point that I think is very important to underline there. Let me actually like to bring in one of our student questions, a live student question that we're going to invite from a student in the School of Liberal Arts. We're going to invite Deja Wells, who we've invited to ask a question. She's a member of my student advisory board, and she has a question for the panel. Deja, welcome. You want to pop your camera on and your microphone off, or at least your microphone, you can ask us a question.
Hi, yeah. So my question is, how will the Biden administration appease the progressive wing of the Democratic Party with a likely Republican-controlled Senate?
And do you want to ask the whole panels or anyone in particular you'd like to target that to? I might go to Scott Nolan on
Yes.
that. Okay. Professor Nolan, thank you, Deja, for the question.
Of course.
Thanks, Deja. So my initial thought is that Joe Biden, especially in the last couple of years, has become quite politically skilled at navigating right to the very center of Democratic politics. I think that his run through the primary was casting him or trying to present him as close to being true centrist moderate as possible. But I think he's more of the center of the Democratic Party. And I think that one way he can work to do well for progressives is through things like executive action and through very carefully chosen executive appointments throughout the federal government. I'm thinking of, for example, big changes in the US attorneys, for example. I'm thinking of big changes in things like healthcare and things like housing, urban development, labor. I'm thinking of a massive amount of executive change, not necessarily just executive order, but rather a changing of the people in positions of power, new blood, new ideas. I really do think it'll be a constellation of people from the decidedly progressive left, and people more of the corporatist kind of style, more like a Pete Buttigieg, more like a Joe Biden, for example. And so I'm looking for very important cabinet appointments and executive action, right? In a world where Mitch McConnell is going to block anything that goes too far away from center right to center left.
That's great. Let me follow your answer there and ask Robert Wesley about a Joe Biden administration and how they will address questions or issues of criminal justice reform and social equality that were raised by the Black Lives Matter movement and in a variety of ways during the summer and fall.
Thanks again so much for that question. I think that that he will. I'm a bit encouraged by the fact that when he gave his acceptance speech, he said that he had the back of the Black community. Clearly, one of the front burner issues for the Black community is criminal justice, given what we've been through this past spring with the murder of George Floyd and all the other cases that have sort of put this issue front and center. But I think reform is going to be difficult. And if I can just take a moment to give you, even though I'm not a historian, I dabble a little bit with legal history, and I really think that the context in which we find ourselves is that this election showed that we were on the precipice of the end of the second Reconstruction. And the second Reconstruction threatened to end in a similar way as the first Reconstruction ended. So, and what facilitates all of that is judicial supremacy and the anti-majoritarian nature of the Supreme Court, which now has a majority of conservative justices. Throughout our history, the Supreme Court has acted as both the arsonist and the firefighter in terms of racial justice. And I think that we're moving into a period in which they will act once again as the arsonists. And I think that this is the sort of legacy of Trumpism, even if we have been successful in getting rid of Trump. So as far as the Supreme Court's anti-majoritarian credentials, we see that the Republican Party has picked 6 of the last 10 justices, although the Republicans lost the popular vote in 6 of the last 7 presidential elections and 16 out of the last 20. So, and this majority is going to really impact the ability of Biden to get anything done, especially if the Democrats do not flip the Senate. A solid conservative majority will issue rulings on voting, on the census, on redistricting, on reproductive rights, on LGBT rights, on healthcare, that will further entrench the power of the Republican Party despite its minority status among the American electorate. And so the sort of things that Biden will get done, I think, will be quite limited. I think what a deeper meaning of the Biden victory is that we're headed not for a period of progressive politics, but for more of a restoration of what we had before Trump came in. But what we had before Trump came into power was not great. So I think that's my view of where it seems we are probably headed. And I think we're headed in that direction because of judicial supremacy.
I'm bringing in some questions that we're getting from our audience that kind of can go further in that line of thinking. One question that we have, it has to do with the ways in which grassroots organizing and registering of new voters. Things just moved around for me. In particular, the efforts of Stacey Abrams played in flipping states like Georgia and Arizona. And actually, in a sense, Jana Lipman's comments before kind of dovetail with some things you're just saying now, Professor Wesley. Do you think that these states, and this can be to, a number of you could answer this question, are trending blue in the future, or that we see, it's a different question asked whether we were seeing the election results in Georgia, I think someone just answered it, it's gone, showed cracks in the idea that the South, including where we are in Louisiana, was just impermeable and would be permanently red. But we've the work that Stacey Abrams did in Georgia to register so many voters seems to have had a really important effect, in terms of those movements. Does anyone want to take a crack at those questions? I put in 3 different questions at once there. Scott, do you have a jump at that? Yeah.
I was actually going to ask Jana what she thought about it.
Jana, go ahead.
I'll take it. I mean, I think it's going to depend. I mean, I think that it demonstrates 2 things. One is it does demonstrate that grassroots organizing was effective in Georgia for the Democratic Party, right? So for Stacey Abrams was able to register people to vote and turn them out. But I also think, going to in some ways Scott's earlier point, we also saw massive rises in new voters who voted for President Trump, right? And so we saw huge engagement at the polls this election. And I do not think that the South in general is going to change its political sensibility. There's nothing that to me that would demonstrate that. I do think it demonstrates that if people are organized, that they're more likely to vote. And that the more there's like organizing on the ground, that it's not just, and it's not just knocking on doors the day before. It's not just phone calls the day before. It's a longer, much slower, much more involved process about committing to communities and organizing. But I would add that, and I think this was what Scott was saying before, that there's a way in which there were voters who came out for economic policy, but there are also people who came out, new voters, lots of new voters who in fact are attracted to President Trump and that version of a sort of a very visceral politics. And I'm not even sure if it's conservative politics per se, but who are actually that brought them to the polls. So we see new voters across the board. I think that organizing is key. So I don't know if that answers it, but I do not see the South more broadly switching in any dramatic fashion. I think that depends. More urban places, North Carolina potentially could continue to be in play, Georgia, but for example, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Tennessee, Kentucky, not in the short term.
Well, the idea, and we're going to go to another live questioner, but we'll come back to Louisiana politics a little bit after that, after this question, unless this question is about Louisiana politics. But this idea, but important, especially for our students, to see so many new voters, not only young voters, but in different communities having such an effect. I think most non-Americans are struck by how few people actually vote in the United States, and to see historic numbers was obviously very encouraging, and yet still there's so many people who are not voting. So, all right, let me welcome Amanda Krantz, who is a student in the School of Liberal Arts, and we welcome her to ask a question to this panel. Thanks, Amanda, for joining us.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. So my question was for Professor Haugeberg, who I actually had my first semester my freshman year. So as like a historian who studies women's history, I'm wondering how you think Kamala Harris's appointment into the White House will affect women in politics in the future? And also, do you believe that there's a lot riding on her performance in the White House and how people are going to perceive her?
Yeah. So I'm gonna take this back to the 19th century, Amanda, women's history style. But one thing that I was just reading was actually it's I have it right beside me. It's Martha Jones's new book, Vanguard, which is about the history of Black women, especially around suffrage. And a chapter that I'm reading right now is about Frances Ellen Watkins Harper. And one thing that she pointed out she was this was right after the Civil War. There was a fight about the 15th Amendment, the right to vote, and whether women should be included. And Elizabeth Cady Stanton put down her foot and said, no way, it's not right that African American men will have the right to vote before well-educated white women. And Frances Harper chimed in and she said, we are all bound up together in one great bundle of humanity. And she was pointing out, if you don't understand this movement to uplift, it's going to take you down too. Like that Black women are the canary in the coal mine on this issue. And so there's this really poignant way in which Kamala Harris embodies, I think, again, this way in which we're all bound up in this together. This culmination of separate efforts to get African Americans into office, and now this more recent effort to get Asian American people into office, which Professor Lipman will tell you is a very huge hurdle in U.S. history. And again, Scott Nolan can speak to this, but we know that it's very significant for children to see themselves in elected office. We know this with occupations as well, that when people don't see people who look like them in certain occupations, they can't imagine themselves in those occupations. One thing that's interesting, and this isn't me speaking as a historian, but just as an observer of the media, there was a relaxed nature to Kamala Harris that wasn't there with Hillary Clinton when she ran. And I think it was because of the scrutiny that Hillary Clinton was under. And that could have been because she was running for president and not vice president. But there's something interesting, I think, that communication scholars are going to be studying about her demeanor, her comportment. That again, she was more relaxed and more able to be free with her positions on policy. So, great question, Amanda.
Amanda, thank you for the question. Oh, and there she goes. Let me ask another question from our Q&A. It's a professor for both professors Haugeberg and Nolan, and it builds on the question of voting and women voters in particular, that after Trump's victory in 2016, there was a lot of surprise and criticism about Trump's support among white women voters. You remember that was talked about quite a while, for months, if not years later. And people pointed out that this kind of bashing of voters felt a bit like singling out women for criticism that was not leveled at white men, kind of second guessing the false consciousness of their votes to a certain extent. If I understand the question right, there's a lot of talk this year about both candidates needing to win over white suburban women. So what role is female gender playing or not playing in the way that white people vote, comes the question. And that, I'll say, comes from Professor Roseanne Adderley from the History and Africana Studies program.
Karissa, do you want to start with the history and I'll touch on the modern?
Well, I mean, I can tell you that historically there are a lot of conservative white women, and that acknowledging that, I think, is really important for just acknowledging the complexity of women. Anytime we pigeonhole them one way or another, I think we're denying their humanity. One thing that I'll be curious to hear from Scott is that we see a lot of movement in the suburbs of Philadelphia. So these white suburban women that had been voting Republican, voted Republican in 2016, did realign and did vote for Biden in 2020. So there's this complexity in which, like, the numbers look flat or even higher, but in particular areas, in particular suburbs, we did see movement. So I'll be curious to know what you make of this.
So for me, I think one of the important variables that intersects gender, at least in the last two elections, is the presence of a college degree or education, broadly speaking. And so there's this whole idea that there's two distinct groups of white women in American politics that both parties are fighting over. And really the narrative, I'm talking about from political campaigns, advertisements, to the policy issues that get stressed, to white women, for example, who do not have a college degree versus white women who do, demonstrates to me that but both parties perhaps are not talking to women in a sort of as whole people, thinking, okay, if I only extend one tiny little policy or one specific issue to a woman, I'll be able to lock her vote down, whether it's abortion access or whether it's pro-life or pro-choice, or whether or not it's some suburban issue, right? Environmentalism, for example, right? Social consciousness issues, right? I just find it really interesting how, for example, as you said, there's definitely lots of conservative women in America, but I definitely think there's two different lanes of politics for white women, and it branches off at education. And to me, I think communication scholars are also going to be looking at, for example, how these women are targeted, how they're talked to, and how in some ways they're taken for granted, right? At times by the Republicans and at times by the Democrats. Yeah.
Yeah, by the way, I want to just take a moment to talk about Louisiana politics. We are in Louisiana. We are residents of Louisiana and vote in Louisiana. And this was while there was not a lot of drama by most polling about the national offices that were up for election, there was quite a lot of drama in terms of some of the amendments and so on, and the referendums that were at the bottom of the end of the ballot that we followed out. And I want to talk in particular about the first proposition, and I'll ask this to Professor Haugeberg again. Last week, Louisianans voted to add an amendment to the state constitution clarifying that abortion is not a protected right. A lot of people who voted for or against that really wondered what that meant. Can you explain to us what I think it was passed with more than 67% or something along those lines. What that actually means for the state, what the status of that vote actually portends.
Yeah, so it was incredibly complicated. And in a nutshell, what it says is that judges are not at liberty to point to any part of the Louisiana Constitution as a justification for permitting the right to abortion or funding of abortion. It mentioned both. And in practical terms, this doesn't change anything at this point. It was done in response. There have been a handful of women in key states, notably Kansas and West Virginia, who brought claims arguing that really strict anti-abortion laws violate some aspect of their state constitution. And as any student who's taken a con law class knows that most state constitutions have kind of like a mini version of the Bill of Rights in them, like all men are created equal, have the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So it's making those kinds of claims that some women have argued, you know what, having a strict prohibition on abortion denies me the right to liberty. I'm not free to do what I want with my body. And in a handful of states, again, in 10 states, judges have agreed with this. Notably, the Supreme Court of Kansas, a very conservative state, agreed with that line of reasoning. So in response to these 10 states that have agreed with this logic, anti-abortion activists mobilized to ensure that this didn't become a bigger trend. And the first state to mobilize was West Virginia, after a lower level judge had agreed to this line of reasoning. So the voters of West Virginia wanted to make it crystal clear that judges were not to look at their state constitution and find any sort of justification for legal abortion. Now, practically in Louisiana, did we need to be concerned that a judge would agree that our Constitution allows for a right to abortion? Probably not. And even if a lower level judge had, if this had gotten kicked up, for example, to the Fifth Circuit, it would have been nullified. We have a very conservative apparatus in the South. And so practically speaking, there was no need to be concerned if you oppose abortion rights. But again, this just like really codifies the anti-abortion nature of the state of Louisiana.
Let's talk a little bit
May
about.
I just jump in on that for a
Please,
moment,
yeah.
Brian?
Yeah.
If there's and I think that's probably right. There are just two things that I would say in addition, which is there's an expectation that Trump's latest pick, Amy Coney Barrett, is going to, along with the other conservatives on the U.S. Supreme Court, overturn Roe v. Wade. And if and when they do, what this Louisiana amendment does is says you cannot now sue under state law for abortion rights. So I think that, they might have been acting initially in order to sort of stave off a sort of rear guard maneuver to try to seek rights under state constitutions. But I think that it also means that as we go forward, if there's a loss of federal rights, there will also be no state rights.
May I follow up on that? So Louisiana, prior to this election, already had a trigger law on the books. So we're already positioned, if Roe v. Wade is overturned, to immediately impose a criminal prohibition on abortion. One thing that's different, though, with the constitutional amendment that was passed last week, though, is that is even stricter because it doesn't have any exemptions for life, health, rape, incest, nothing. So it permits us not only to, put this law that's been ready to go since 1973 into effect, but then even in stricter terms.
And the second point that I wanted to make is that, but this also shows the real lack of principle on the right, because part of the reason why this Trump got this appointment was because they wanted to make sure that the Supreme Court had the power to undermine reproductive rights, but they don't want courts in state courts to have the same freedom to interpret state constitutions. So we like judicial supremacy when we get the outcome that we want, and we don't like judicial supremacy when we may not get the outcome that we want.
I'll tell you, we're gonna go a little bit longer. I can see the room is still filled with people listening to us, so we'll go a couple more questions, because one of the things that we've not addressed, believe me, I would love, there's questions in our chat about the future of the Electoral College, questions about judicial appointments, all of which we can come back to if we have a moment. But I don't want to repeat the error of the two presidential debates, which was striking to many of us, in that there was no mention of international relations or foreign affairs of the United States. Remarkable, right? Usually that's the subject of an entire debate. And as someone who's written at least one book, I'm speaking of myself, about the United States in the world and how people look at United States politics and society, I don't want to fall into that trap. And I'm going to ask Jana Lipman to help us tease out some of the elements here. First of all, just more generally speaking, if you've been following any international responses to this electoral campaign or even the results, I mean, today we saw some interesting heads of state acknowledge Vice President-elect Biden's victory. Benjamin Netanyahu, for example, interestingly and almost surprisingly, because he'd been very closely allied with President Trump. Angela Merkel, President Macron in France apparently made a comment of "Welcome back, America," so very kind of partisan kind of comment in a sense, but also a lot of heads of state who haven't been acknowledging this either. So anyway, it's sort of an open question about how this has been playing out in the world as you see it, and then we can go historical as soon as you want.
Sure, yeah, I'm probably going to go historical very quickly.
Sure.
I would say a few things. One is I actually don't think it's all that surprising in terms of the fact that for the most part, Western European countries have been congratulating President-elect Biden, and someone like in Brazil and in Russia, there has not been that acknowledgement. And to me, given the Republican Party's sort of similar position, that doesn't surprise me that that's being reflected internationally all that much. Mm-hmm. But what I would say is, I think your question, I guess I would say two things about international policy. Both of them are a bit broad. So one of the changes with the Trump presidency, which I actually think Joe Biden most likely will go back to, quote, the norm pretty quickly, is that for much of the 20th century, and if any of the students from my US foreign policy are in the room right now, I was talking about liberal internationalism this week because I was talking about World War I. And since at least World War I, the United States has been claiming to bring democracy to the world, has been talking about how America is this positive force in the world and really is able to bring democracy, free trade, capitalism, human rights, etc. And that was really bipartisan. There's a way in which, yes, Democrats supported that, but that was also the philosophy that brought Democrats to the Vietnam War. And Republicans supported that, but that brought Republicans to the Iraq War, right? But it was bipartisan. There was a way in which there was this common language of American exceptionalism. And one thing that I've really grappled with, and maybe I should be sharing this with so many folks in this room, but if you've taken my classes, you'll know that I'm fairly critical of US policy. I'm critical of Democrats in foreign policy, I'm critical of Republicans in foreign policy, but I'm generally critical. I'm like, we say we're supporting democracy abroad, but actually, look, we overthrow democratic governments, whether it's in Guatemala or Iran. And with the Trump years, I had to really wrestle with my own critique, because all of a sudden, the United States was not even saying it was supporting democracy abroad. And so what does it mean when the United States, in fact, moves away from liberal internationalism and doesn't have the rhetoric of supporting democracy or human rights, even though someone like myself as a scholar has arguably, developed my career criticizing that it's not following through on those claims, the US is not actually even making those claims anymore. And I think that's something that in some ways that as Americans we need to reckon with and to think about more seriously. I do think Biden will quickly return to that language. And I think the United States will continue to not live up to those promises. But I think the language will come back. That's the first thing I want to say.
Let me, Jana, before you go further, that's such an interesting point. And one of the, just to hold on to that great point for a moment, yeah, Biden has said that he will on day one, rejoin the Paris Accords. I was going to say that one of the things that's very interesting now, as opposed to, as you say, there used to be not a lot of variation in foreign policy for the last of modern presidents, and minor points in some places, but a lot of continuities. And yet we're in a moment now that has never been a more globally unifying moment in two ways. One, of course, is the COVID-19 pandemic, which is obviously, although there's variations in certain countries and certain policies, it's really affected the entire world massively and continues to do so. And so Biden has made comments about, bringing back a kind of leadership to show people not only to help ourselves, we're contributing more deaths than any other country on their own, but also to kind of lead the way in terms of science in certain ways. And then the other is climate change, which a lot of people, it comes up in a lot of different ways, but here let's talk about it as a global issue. So this kind of, in some ways, yeah, yeah.
That was my second point.
Well, I'm a moderator who's anticipating where you're going. So go ahead.
Second point, we have to redefine foreign policy. So it's not, so the second point is that, yes, we still need to look at, what is the United States role in NATO, or what should NATO's role be more than 60 years after World War II? We still need to pay attention to whether it's, foreign policy in the Middle East, or whether we want to look at Russia. All of that sort of traditional foreign policy still matters. But I think it's really important that we reframe this idea of what counts as foreign policy. And what I would put in that bucket is COVID-19. This is an international problem. We need to think about it internationally. 2, migration, which, we can talk about broadly, but migration is an international issue. It's about crossing borders. It's about relationships between countries. And 3, which is the big one, which is climate change. And that climate change is clearly a matter of foreign policy. It's a matter of international relations. And I think that it's really important that we begin discussing it as a sort of critical foreign policy issue. And I would agree that in the debates, they didn't talk about climate change enough or international policy enough. But we also, as a country, I think, need to start thinking of those, what would honestly often be seen, oh, it's an environmental issue, and saying, no, this is actually a critical foreign policy matter. How are we going to address it? And I think that, to be honest, that is less of a framework than sort of a traditional sort of foreign policy, what the State Department sort of imagines its role to be. It's not about just who's an ambassador or sort of who's on this conference table, but it really is about creating a larger international sort of dialogue and hopefully, in fact, solutions and changes in terms of the environment.
I'm absolutely seconding what Jana and Brian has said, because I think that based on my reading of at least 3 Joe Biden biographies over the summer and this fall, I have a sense that his return to the foreign policy, return to the international stage, and kind of a reinvigorated America will happen through a 2-pronged approach at the beginning, which is a combination of environmentalism and healthcare. And so a return to the World Health Organization, return to Paris, the climate accords. But I think the next step is things like, for example, international infrastructure, immigration reform across the hemisphere, right? And I also think, for example, possibly something along the lines of like voting rights in the United States and the developing world might make for a kind of half foreign, half domestic policy that a lot of people can get behind. I also am very curious to see how foreign aid gets parceled out in a Biden administration. And I also think that there's going to be a tremendous amount of turnover in the State Department. Just because so many people, so many really great, well-qualified people from all different ideologies and parties left the State Department in the last 4 years. And there's going to be an opportunity for people at all sorts of ideologies to get into policy areas, right? All the more reason to get a degree here at Tulane.
Yeah, no, there's some very interesting, and I'd say this to the students, we still have a very full room, a room that would take a stadium if we were doing social distancing. So, but for the students who are interested in international relations, who are doing language study, Julian Castro, who sometimes people are talking about as a potential candidate for Secretary of State, or certainly an interesting person to listen to on this, is talking about a call in an interview yesterday for a new kind of foreign service act, or a new call for more reopening the foreign service exams and so on. And you know, the decimation of the bureaucracy of the State Department, which has been written about in a number of interesting places. Actually, Michael Lewis, our New Orleans author's Fifth Risk, his less known recent book about the decimation of the bureaucracies in a number of areas, including the State Department, is really important. To Ronan Farrow's book on the State Department falling apart early in this administration. But there's a lot of jobs there to be had, as Castro was saying. It will be a renaissance for the federal government because there's a lot of jobs to fill that were never even filled over the last 4 years. And so it's a great time for those folks who are and college students who are thinking about their own futures and jobs in an unsure economy, to look at those foreign service exams and keep studying your languages. So I have to make a little plug for language learning, you know, because it's true, there's going to be a lot of opening up there. It actually makes me think, Jana, your comments about the ways in which we haven't talked about during the campaign or the debates in general, international relations, goes back to something Professor Haugeberg said earlier, Karissa, when you were talking about the nostalgia, the dangers of the nostalgia, as if, you know, the world were a simpler place. And that's obviously not the case in a global pandemic, and with global climate change is the other great risk that we're all obviously well aware of. Let's end with a couple last questions. Professor Wesley, I asked you, like, there's a lot of talk about judicial appointments as we look for, you talk about jobs that are opening up or not, and questions that we've gotten about the Electoral College. A lot of students have been saying to me this week, just out of frustration, you know, how is it possible that with all of the greater and greater disparity of the popular vote and the electoral vote, talking about basically 5 million votes difference now, or even in the polling by 538, Nate Silver's predicting how many millions of votes Biden would need to win by in the popular vote in order to have a chance to win in the Electoral College. Is that something that's going to be taken up at all, or does it all depend on those two runoff elections in the state of Georgia coming up in early January?
It would require a constitutional amendment in order to change the method by which the president and vice president are elected, and this is something that I think people on the left are often afraid of opening that Pandora's box, because once you do, it's hard to maintain control over the reforms that are put forward. I mean, clearly, an amendment could be proposed, but it would require changing the Constitution. I think that it should be changed. I think we should have election of the president by popular vote, but the Republicans have no incentive to do that. If they believe that they could win based on that change, it would be different. But I think that they've pretty much concluded that they can't win. And this is also the reason why we have political gerrymandering, is because they know without the gerrymandering, it would be much more difficult for Republicans to win elections.
May I comment
Yes,
on that?
please. Yeah.
So Scott, I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on this, because I just read something that said that there might be more bipartisan appetite for abolishing the Electoral College as Texas changes in the next 4 years. That soon Republicans in Texas are going to see the folly of the Electoral College. Is this something that you've been tracking?
Well, there's two things that are on my radar. And one of them, as I typed up as we were sitting here, is the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact. It's not.
That sounds very wonky, Scott Nolan.
It is.
And
I
love it.
And thank goodness we're all wonks here, so it's a safe space. And so Colorado recently adopted it, went forward in 2020, and basically it's an agreement among the different states put in place, usually a couple states at a time, that says that their electoral college votes will go to the candidate who wins the popular vote. Now, there's all sorts of strategic maps tied to this project about what states would be necessary for this to effectively render the electoral college vote useless. And so if you could, students in the who are interested in this, National Popular Vote Interstate Compact is what you're looking for. A coordinated effort to reform the electoral college, not originating in DC, but happening in state legislatures via things like ballot propositions, proposed constitutional amendments, et cetera. And there is a kind of set of dominoes that needs to fall where a certain number of states will pledge their electoral votes to the eventual popular vote winner, which kind of makes the electoral college actually work to the opposite effect that Republicans would be used to, which may indirectly force their hand to equalizing votes. The other thing that I've been thinking about a lot is if we got rid of an electoral college, then there would be an incentive not to suppress the vote, but to get it out in every single state, because Texas would all of a sudden say, my goodness, we got to make sure that every Texan that can vote that could vote will. And we want to automatically enroll all of our people, because the more popular votes we have, the more candidates will come here, the more promises they'll make, the more important we'll be. Whereas the Electoral College says, you don't need to worry very much about California, you don't need to worry very much about the Dakotas, and you need to spend all your time in Pennsylvania. And voter suppression in Pennsylvania then becomes this huge political pile of dynamite. Whereas if you got rid of the Electoral College and you said every vote is equal, then every state has a concerted interest to maximize its number of votes. And so you would actually, I think, have an incentive to remove barriers to voting and say, Florida wants to have more voters than Texas. You know why? Because Florida wants to be more powerful than Texas in electing the president of the United States, but that's not the system that we have, right? And so one, National Popular Vote Interstate Compact. The next thing is voter suppression is going to be on everybody's radar in the next 4 years. We do a panel just on that.
Yeah.
Well, anything that disincentivizes felon disenfranchisement, I'm in favor.
You know, I'm really savoring the opportunity to speak to these four wonderful colleagues and learning from you. And we said before we came on the air that when these things go well, they become a conversation. So I love how this has become a conversation. It's been really enjoyable. I note we're going to have to wrap it up now. We're way over our time, and I promised these good panelists that there would be an eventual end to this. I will note for the record that the room remained full. And so if this were the kind of live event that we all miss and love, there would be a big crowd of people rushing the stage to ask you more questions. But in the absence of that, I want to give some thanks to people who organized this. Of course, this is a co-sponsored event with the Division of Student Affairs. And I want to thank especially Dusty Porter, the Vice President for Student Affairs, for giving me the idea to put something together with you all when we had thought about this, and also working together with the college Democrats and the college Republicans, who gave us recommendations of people to reach out to. Also our students who joined us both in asking questions, and colleagues and faculty colleagues. I'm sorry that we didn't get to them all. You may have seen folks typing answers to some of them, but we had quite a lot of questions, and especially thanking Deja Wells and Amanda Krantz for coming on for live questions. I want to thank Joe Mistro, who you see up there. I think everyone sees you up there, who really organized, no, they don't see you up there, but I see you up there, who organized so much of this, and our Zoom producers, and Joe for putting together and moderating and sending me text messages during this as almost like a TV producer. I think we might make this a show on the road, but thanks for that. And Sars Trinidad, who is our wonderful undergraduate, one of our student workers in the Dean's office, who designed a fabulous poster and flyer that you saw circulated digitally. So I wanted to thank her for doing that. But especially, of course, I want to thank Robert Wesley, Karissa Haugeberg, Jana Lipman, and Scott Nolan for agreeing to do this, and then agreeing to do it on a different night, so kind of agreeing twice. And of course, for giving us all of the expertise, the wisdom, the conversation, and the fun of having the opportunity to think about, dissect, and analyze an historic election. Maybe we'll make this a recurring show. I feel like we've been watching so many of these kind of events on television, but I hope you'll agree that having some deeper context and being able to step back, not only historically, but to look theoretically, at some of these questions and to really look at the deeper question. There's so much more we could talk about. I hope the students will take classes with all of these great folks and continue to read and think and study all of their subjects and languages. And we look forward to your continued participation and helping us to make this a better future. I always like to say you cannot be as pessimistic as we sometimes are in these moments. You cannot really be anything but an optimist to be an educator, because you see your students in front of you and they are the future, and we have to look forward to that. So with that, this is for you, the students, and we really enjoyed having you here tonight. Thanks again from Tulane University, and we're signing off. So thanks you all.